الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله اللهم علمنا ينفعنا وانفعنا بما علمتنا زدنا علما إنك أنت العليم الحكيم وصلى الله على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم أجمعين. اللهم أخرج من ظلمات الوهم وكل من الفهم وافتح علينا بمعرفة العلم وسهل أخلاقنا بالحلم واجعلنا ممن يستمعون قولا ويتبعون أحسنا وبعد. So alhamdulillah, welcome everyone to our third session discussing the book A Unique Pedagogical Approach in the Quran by Imam Muhammad al-Buti, rahimahullah. And we're going to pick up where we left off, which is on page 8 in the book. And the Imam is talking about, again, he's bringing us back to the importance of the Quran and how the Quran should be the foundation for everything that we do. So he says, is the foundation of pedagogy, and our pedagogy should be based on brilliant and exemplary pedagogical foundations. He says, in order to disclose these foundations, one only needs to study this majestic book as it deserves to be studied thoroughly and correctly. Then one should be sincere in devoting oneself to extracting those foundations, formulating them, and putting them in a framework which rules can be derived and supported by evidence from the book. Now, what he's getting at here is something we discussed last time, which is the problem of Muslim educational specialists, Muslims who are engaged in this field of pedagogy, just aping the West, right? So he said, why am I going into Al Azhar and I'm doing a diploma in translation in the Arabic department, and I'm reading John Dewey and Herbert and Dalton? Why am I doing this? Where are the Muslim books? Where are the books written by Muslim scholars? And again, we went over this problem of the fact that you have, number one, you have these scholars from the West, whether it's John Dewey or whoever, or they could be British or they could be French or whoever they are, their pedagogical approach, their curricula, the way they teach people is based on their experience, is based on what they know and what they're aware of in their countries and in their culture and their civilization. That's the first problem, right? Which again is not really a problem in terms of that we blame them. We can't blame, right? We can't blame uh Americans for only being familiar with America, right? Or blame British people for only being familiar with Britain, or blaming the French for only being familiar with the French, or with French culture and French civilization. That's not the issue. But it's a problem for us because we're aping them, and that's the second part. So the second part is you have Muslims who just look at that pedagogical approach of the Westerners and just imitate it, just completely follow it, imitate it, imbibe it, and don't see how it might not fit. It might not be appropriate. Hey, wait a second. Maybe we're completely different. Maybe their understanding of religion is completely different. Maybe their understanding of psychology is completely different. Maybe their understanding of the world is completely different. Instead, we just import it in. So what he's doing is he's bringing us back to this importance of rooting everything in the Quran. So we're Muslims, and we're going to have a pedagogical approach. It has to be rooted in the Quran. We had this discussion yesterday with the other book club, for people in the US, the ArcView book club, and we were discussing this point as well. But someone raised the point just about like psychology, right? Like why is it that, for example, if you want to have a psychological approach, it's there in the Quran. That's what the book Depression and Anxiety is all about, right? But instead, Muslims just look at the West and they just ape that. So okay, well, let's imitate the Western psychologists and their approaches and their methods, and we'll just transplant it into our Muslim countries and hope for the best. You see, so it's the same thing that what he's talking about here. So what he's calling for towards the end of this chapter is he's making the point, because again, Imam al-Buti, this book again is not a massively long book. It's not like a PhD thesis, right? This book is maybe 13,000 words, right? What he's getting at is because again his specialty, again, he's a faqih. He's an alim, he's an usuli, he's a mufassir. He has lots of other specializations. Education is not necessarily a specialization. So what he's doing here in this book is he's laying a foundation and saying, let's just have a foundation stone for a pedagogical approach from the Quran. And then that's why he's saying this is just my little effort. This is just not even a drop in the ocean. So what he's hoping by putting this book out there, right? And now how many lots in English is he's hoping that there are Muslims out there. He's hoping that there are Muslims out there who are devoted, who are in the field of education, right? Who are maybe teachers or curriculum designers or school governors or whoever they are, right? Or schools inspectors, maybe whoever they are. And he's hoping that they can look at this book and say, hey, you know what? I can take this and I can expand it into a full blown study. I can turn it into a PhD. I can turn it into a book that's hundreds of pages long, if not longer, maybe 1,000, maybe it's multi-volume, laying out a thorough approach, a Quranic pedagogical approach, right? And that's why the book is called A Unique Pedagogical Approach, Minhaj Tarbawi, right? He's not calling it al-Minhaj Tarbawi. He's not saying like this is it, this is the be all and end all. Imam al-Buti, I have laid down the approach. That's not what he's saying. He's saying, just, let's have a look at this. This is what I've discovered. This is what I've noticed. And so what he's hoping by putting this book out there is he hoping that there are people out there, there are Muslims out there, and he lists these descriptions that they are sincere, they have knowledge, and they will build on this and come out with a proper, thorough pedagogical approach based on the Quran, right? And he says, maybe there's sincerity towards their scientific specialization if their hearts have been emptied of other doctrinal or religious motives, right? So again, he's hoping that the people who do this, like you're not polluted by these Western ideas, right? You're not just trying to Islamize John Dewey. No, you're actually going to start from scratch and say, no, let's start from the Quran and build up from there. We'll push them towards reciting the sublime book and then studying it and learning it. After that, maybe they will refrain from chasing after those foreign experiences and theories, which they confine their scientific specializations to and never step outside of it. Because again, this issue of I was discussing this last night. I'm sure we discussed this before. This inferiority complex that Muslims have, right? We need to get out of this, right? We can't just be looking at the British or the Americans or whoever else comes along after them, the Russians, the Chinese, and be like, oh, they're on top of the world now. Let's just imitate them, right? Let's just close our eyes and imitate them because they're doing something right because they're in this position, right? That's the wrong assumption to make. One of the things that Imam al-Buti made very, very clear in the Civilization book, which is again called Minhaj al-Hadar, the approach. The approach of human civilization of Quran is he made this point very, very clear. He said, never ever think that the British or the Americans, whoever else, are running the world, right? Who are in that top spot. Never ever think that they're there by merit. They're not there on merit. They're there because we stepped down. They're there because we walked away. We abdicated. We stepped away from the position of authority. So someone has to take over, right? It reminds me. I think I've mentioned this in this class before, in this session before, with this Halaqah. You don't assume that just because someone's in that position that they're the best person for the job. You don't make that assumption. And I remember this was made clear to me by one of my students in Jeddah, an English student. And it's a sad metaphor, but it really hit home when he gave a presentation because we had to do my students had to do presentations like get up from the class and speak in English, and they would talk about their families. And I had one student who I noticed was very, very dedicated, very, very hardworking, but always but at the same time distracted. Like he was always taking phone calls in class. He always had to run out. Sometimes he would come late. Sometimes he would be absent. He had like lots of, I could tell that he had other responsibilities, right? But he's still a very hardworking student. So I wouldn't knock him for that. But in his presentation, he actually revealed everything. And he said, listen, my father passed away when I was 12, and I have, X amount of younger siblings. I had to man up. I had to be the man of the house. I was like, oh, that's why, right? So yes, he's in that position, but that's not because, but he's not in that position because he's the best person for the job. He's in that position because no one else is. He had to do it. He had to be on the man of the house at 12. And when I was teaching, he was maybe 18, 19, right? So again, when we look at these other people who quote unquote seem to be ruling the world and running affairs and dictating things, again, they're not there in that position of power and influence just because they necessarily because they earned it, right? They're there because we stepped away. We just abdicated the responsibility and started chasing the dunya and getting distracted by other things and watching Arabs Got Talent or whatever it is. We just absconded, and now these people are in that position. So it's important to keep that in mind. So he says maybe they will refrain. These people refrain. Whoever takes on this task, these people refrain from these foreign experiences and theories, which they confine their studies to, and instead they will come and use the hidden contents of Allah the Exalted's book to create new principles and theories in the field. Right? They're just going to strip everything down and say, no, let's start from the Quran. And they will hold the honor of creativity among their peoples. And on top of that, they will have an immense reward with their Lord. Right? So again, if you are someone who's in the field of education in one way, shape, or form, right? Like I said, if you are a teacher, if you are a curriculum designer, if you are a schools inspector, or whatever it is, this is a huge field that's just open for you to reap reward from Allah and to do something of immense service for the Muslims, to take this, right, take the ideas from here and then build like a full-blown uh, pedagogical approach based on the Quran. And that's why al-Buti at the end, he says, and maybe alongside them, I will have a small share of the reward, right? I'll just get a little piece of the reward because I'll be the one who guided someone. And that's why he says the hadith and Mr. Allah, so I'm saying whoever guides someone towards something good has the same reward as the one who does it, right? I think right? The one who shows something good, who points the way to something good, has the same reward as the one who does it. So then he talks about the foundations of the pedagogical approach in the Quran. So this is now on page 11. And he says, he makes this difference between pedagogical approach and pedagogical principles. Now, pedagogical principles is vast, right? And we have these. And the pedagogical principles, like I was going to discuss this last night, there's lots of little tidbits that you can think of, right? Like one thing we discussed yesterday, for example, was how the fact that Muslims don't teach people according to age, right? We don't have this idea of like, well, all the 7-year-olds go together, and then all the 8-year-olds go together, and then all 9-year-olds go together, and all 10-year-olds go together. We don't do that because we see that as counterproductive. So how if you're growing up and you're trying to learn how to be an adult and be a fully functioning adult in the world, how does it benefit you to be constantly around your own age group? Right? No, we teach you according to subject. So if you're going to go into a Quran class and do hifz, and you're 10 years old, yeah, you might have kids younger than you or starting at a younger age. You might have people who are older than you. You could be 9. You have someone who's 6 with you. You have someone who's 12 with you. You have someone who's 24 with you or older, and you benefit. Right? The people who are older than you are role models and exemplars for you, and then you yourself are an exemplar role model for the people younger than you. Right? But it's broader than that, right? Because he says the pedagogical principles, not the approach, the pedagogical principles are the rulings, systems, and values that Islam has firmly established and called to, which are based on refining the individual and improving his manners and conduct. So all of these things are the pedagogical principles. It's everything that's about improving you, improving your manners, improving your conduct. And this includes the rulings of what is lawful and unlawful, as well as the various moral values that the Quran calls to. So everything in the Quran, all these rulings, all of that is considered pedagogical principles. Don't fornicate, don't drink alcohol, don't eat pork. All of that is part of it. All of that comes under the rubric of pedagogical principles, because these are all things that are going to improve you, improve your conduct, rectify your character, make you a better person, bring you closer to Allah. But the approach is different. The approach is, okay, well, how do we teach all of that to someone? That's the approach. How do we take all of that and put it in a curriculum, put it in a method, have some sort of methodology that makes that person, that improves that person, that makes that person the ideal Muslim? How do we do that? So he says, when we say the pedagogical approach, we mean the way and path and the manifestations of temptation therein, right? And he mentions manifestations of temptation because, again, you have to have an approach or a curriculum that not only teaches people these morals and values and what is halal and what is haram, but also protects them from the various pitfalls that come along the way. So, for example, right, when we're dealing with shaitan, right, which we always are, right, shaitan has different tricks along the way. So, for example, if you think back to the depression anxiety book, we talked about this point of how you can be so a person might spend his whole life or a huge portion of his life away from Allah, remote from Allah. And then he decides, okay, I need to sort myself out. Like I need to stop sinning. I need to start praying. I need to start fasting. I need to quit all these bad habits. I need to stop messing around, and I need to be straight. And then Shaitan whispers to him and says, "Really, right? You think you're going to be forgiven after all that?" Okay, but then this person might go ahead and rectify himself. right? He might ignore shaitan at that point and say, no, no, I'm going to rectify myself. And then he rectifies himself and he starts praying and he starts fasting and he starts learning his deen and memorizing the Quran and being on the straight path. But then shaitan tries again and says, oh, wow, look at you. You're amazing now, right? And that's another pitfall. And then uj, this disease of uj can come in, right? This idea of like being amazed at oneself, being astonished by oneself. That disease can slip in, right? And then arrogance can follow. And then the arrogance can lead to other things, right? So how do we have an approach that would actually manage all of these pitfalls, that would actually nurture people, raise people, educate people, and then at the same time protect them from all the pitfalls that can come along the way, right? That can come along their journey. So, so it says when we're talking about the pedagogical approach, we're not talking about all these values and rulings. We're not talking about that. Okay. And so he said, and then he goes on to say, what we're talking about when we mean the pedagogical approach is also we're talking about what is in the Quran alone. We're not talking about Islam in general. Okay. We're not talking about Islam in general. Okay. We're just talking about the Quran. Because this is Islam, in that it is a religion, is considered in its totality to be the pedagogical approach for the human essence, representing the soul, the body, and the mind, so that it can reach its innate original level. Okay, but we said what we're trying to do here, we're trying to focus on the Quran alone, right? Because if we take it further, and then we go into the Sunnah, and then we go into the statements of the ulama and the Sahaba and so forth, then it can become a very, very big project. So let's just start here. Let's just start here with the Quranic approach. Okay. So that's why it says, moreover, the Quranic approach, which is the subject of our discussion in this treatise, branches into many disciplines, branches, and minor subdivisions, right? It does that anyway, right? It would take a long time for us to go into this detail and analyze each one. Instead, we shall take into consideration its most important universal foundations and pillars, right? So he just wants to go into the most important foundations here of the Quranic approach. He doesn't want to go into a long discussion because, again, that would be like a PhD thesis. That would be a book of 700 pages and maybe even several volumes. But he says we will look at these key foundations and study them thoroughly, or each one thoroughly, and this will reveal the extent of their importance in the field of general pedagogy and the extent to which educators in all fields of education need to be guided by them and to depend on them. Okay, so he says becoming aware of these important foundations will lead us to pursuing studies and research. You might have a typo in your book. You should say pursuing studies. It might come across as one word in your book. I don't know. Just make a note. It should be pursuing studies and research, and then to extracting new and wonderful methodological values therein, values that scholars of pedagogy should have been aware of ever since pedagogy became a discipline, or indeed an independent science in itself, or ever since it attained the same importance as all other stages and types of education. Right. So he's saying this is what we should have done. Right. These principles should have been aware. We should have been aware of these as Muslims. We should have been aware of these principles from the beginning. Right? Why we allowed ourselves to just fall into this imitating the West, and we're reading John Dewey and Herbert and all those people, and we just haven't bothered to stop and like, hey, what does Allah say in the Quran? What approach is there in the Quran? How does Allah talk to people in the Quran? How does Allah nurture people in the Quran? Right? And on that note, we have another book on this coming out soon. I was just talking to Ustadh Mahdi about this before, called Adab al-Hiwar fi Kitabillah, right? The Etiquettes of Dialogue in Allah's book, right? Which will be an Arabic and English facing book, inshallah, right? It's just about done. In terms of the actual translation of the work, but now the typesetting will be commencing soon, inshallah. So he says, this is what we mean by the pedagogical approach of the Quran. And then he says there are basically three foundations. There are three foundations. There's rational deliberation, lessons from history, and emotional stimulation. Okay? He says these are the three principles. These are the three key principles that the Quranic approach, the Quranic pedagogical approach, is based on. And I've discussed this before. How are they all connected? How are they all connected? So, for example, the intellect, Allah respects your intellect. Allah talks to you in a way that respects your intellect, but Allah understands that intellect alone is not enough. Intellect alone is not enough. Intellect alone is not going to move a person towards action. And in his other book, Al-Hub fil Quran, Love in the Quran, Imam Ramadan makes this distinction. He says that the intellect is like the headlights on your car. Okay, it can show you the way, right? You turn the headlights on your car, you can see the road in front of you, right? You know where to go. You know where the road is. You know where the hedge is and where the ditches and the bushes. You know where that is, but the road is clear. But the headlights will never move your car, right? You need the engine to move your car. You need the petrol to move your car, whichever analogy you prefer. So he says the emotions are the engine and the petrol. That's what the emotions are. Like people don't do what they understand and comprehend. People do what they love. People do what they enjoy. They do what they are inclined towards. They don't do what they necessarily understand. So based on this principle, Imam al-Buti, and I've explained this before, Imam al-Buti says what you understand from that is people do not become Muslim or not become Muslim or apostate from Islam because of an intellectual reason. They don't do it because they are convinced or they become unconvinced, right? And the ayah he quoted in this regard is in Surah Al-Ma'idah, the fifth chapter, verse 54, where Allah says, "Man yartadda minkum min dinihi, fasawfa ya'ti Allahu biqawmin yuhibbuhum wa yuhibbuna." Right? That whoever amongst you apostates from religion, Allah will bring a people who love Him and He loves them. Right? Or they love Him. Yeah. They love. Yeah. They love Him and they love Him and He loves them. Right? So what he's saying there is that the key point, the key aspect here is love. It's love, right? People will abandon Allah because they love something else. They'll abandon Islam because they love something else, not because they're unconvinced, but they have passions and desires and so forth that they love more than Allah, and that's what they follow. And conversely, that's why people don't become Muslim. There are people who can say, yes, there are people in the West who they can come up with proofs for Allah's existence, brilliant proofs. They can even say Islam's the truth, but then they'll say, hey, I'm not religious. I'm not interested. Right? Imam al to give the example as well. He said, look at, you want to talk about pedagogical approach. As an example, look at the difference between how how the Messenger of Allah Sallallahu prohibited alcohol and how it was done in the US 100 years ago in the Prohibition era. What the Muslims did, what Allah did, I should say, what Allah did and through the Messenger of Allah Sallallahu was to instill the love of Allah and His Messenger first in the believers. That's what Allah did first. The love of Allah and His Messenger was instilled in the Sahaba first. Then, when the prohibition came, when Surah Al-Ma'idah ayah 90 was revealed, and they were told, like leave it, right? Because there were phases. Allah said, don't approach the prayer drunk, right? In Surah Al-Nisa ayah 44, Allah acknowledged there's benefit in it, and then some harm in it, but the harm outweighs the benefit in Surah Al-Baqarah ayah 219. But then in Surah Al-Ma'idah ayah 90, it's like, and when that ayah is revealed, the Sahaba just left it. Why? Because the love of Allah trumped everything, and they left it, right? Whereas if you look in America, you had the government come to the intellectual conclusion, come to the rational conclusion that alcohol is harmful, right? Alcohol is harmful. We should not have alcohol in our society. It's harmful. Rationally, they'd figure that out. So they said, let's ban it. But it failed. Why? Because the emotional attachment to alcohol was still there. People still loved it. And therefore you got bootlegging. You got people like Al Capone, right? And eventually the law had to be reversed because they couldn't see the point of it. But the whole project, the whole prohibition project failed because people's hearts were still attached to it. Intellectually, they gathered it. Yes, it's wrong, but their hearts no. And that's again, it's like you're in the situation where like the headlights are on and can see the path, but the engine's off. The engine's off. It's not going to move. The car's not going to move, and that's why the project failed. So what he's saying here on this page, on page 13, is he's saying that intellect alone cannot win the soul, cannot win the confidence of the soul unless it's supported by evidence from the real world that confirms it. Right. So he's bringing in lessons from history. Right. This is the third aspect. It's like lessons from history are like further evidence that something works. Right. And this is why Allah gives us all these stories in the Quran, all these stories in the Quran to show like this is what happened before, right? This is what Musa had to deal with the children of Israel. This is what Yusuf had to deal with his brothers. This is what Yunus had to deal with the whale. This is what Ibrahim had to deal with his son. And so Allah gives you all these examples from history to show it. Yes, okay, so that's what happened. That's how it was done. Right? And again, it has to be, at the same time, it has to be mobilized by an army of emotions and yearnings. And this is where emotional incitement comes in. And he says, when these three factors come together in the human essence and they lead him in a certain direction, nothing stands in their way. And no barrier can prevent them from reaching that destination. And a person does not fail to be guided with a certain reality and is prevented from fully adhering to it unless one of these factors has not carried out its desired function to serve this reality, unveiling it and facilitating the path towards it. Right. So he says again, and it goes wrong. It goes wrong when one of these things is failing. Right. So again, we have to have the emotional incitement, we have to have the rational understanding, and then we have to have the lessons from history. We have to put those together. If one of those things is missing, then it goes wrong. And I just gave you that example of prohibition in America, right? So you can have the intellectual realization, and they probably had lessons from history as well, right? I mean, I'm not sure, I'm not know that for sure, but they probably did. The American government at the time think, oh yeah, there are countries around the world where alcohol is prohibited, they don't do it, and right, and people are happier, and marriages are stable, and families stay together, and so on and so on. But they probably did have some evidence to go by, right? But the emotional component was missing. And because the emotional component was missing, the whole project failed. Right? That whole legislation failed. So therefore, we will look at how the Quran subjugates each of these three foundations or factors for the sake of educating man and leading towards the path of felicity and integrity of conduct. Okay, so I'll just start this chapter here because I want to stop in a few minutes and open for questions. So the Imam now talks about rational deliberation, which he puts in three aspects, which is identifying man himself, choosing a way that is suited to the mental faculties of people, of all people, okay, and relying on discussion and dialogue. Again, this is the book that's coming out, which is in further detail, right? The etiquettes of dialogue. So man has to know who he is, and then Allah has to speak to people in a way that everyone can understand, right? Allah will use words. We'll see examples of this where Allah will use a word. Allah can use a word, but different people, according to their level, understand it differently. Right? There's a way that a Bedouin will understand the word. There's a way that a city person will understand the word. There's a way that uh, an educated urbanite will understand it, and so forth. Okay, and then relying on discussion and dialogue. Right, so that Allah does not simply dictate truths to human beings. Right, one of the things you'll see in the book, I don't know is, for example, when Allah is talking to us about unseen matters. When Allah is telling us about Jannah, about Yawm al-Qiyamah, about An-Nar, about the Malaika, Allah just gives you the information, right? Why? Because you have no means of checking, right? You are relying on Allah's truthful speech to believe in these things and to affirm these things. But when Allah talks about natural things, natural phenomena, biological things, physical things, Allah will say, look, do they not see? Do they not appreciate? Do they not contemplate? Why? Because for these matters, you do have the ability to go out and look and investigate and research, right? These things are subject to what's called tajriba mushahada, right? They're subject to experience and witnessing and observation, right? Whereas unseen matters, stuff that's in the ghaib, stuff that's in the akhirah, it's not. So Allah just tells you about them. Whereas these other matters that you can investigate, you can explore by yourself, Allah doesn't do that. Allah tells you to think, to do your research, to contemplate, to reflect. So the first aspect, and maybe I can finish this. I'll start today. So he says the first aspect is identifying man before everything else. So he says here, the Quran begins its address to mankind by instructing them, right, I mankind, to look at and reflect on themselves by talking about man's origins, his reality, and how he emerged and increased in number. Okay, and this is very clear in the first verses that were revealed. So again, this is why this is the logical starting point. The first verse revealed, and you will find the same in the first few pages of the written Quran. Right, because again, if you go to Surah Al-Baqarah right at the beginning, Alif Lam Mim, right? If you go right to the beginning of the Quran, Allah breaks down humanity. Allah does the same thing there. He says, okay, there amongst humanity, there are believers, there are disbelievers, and there are munafiqun. And then Allah talks from there. And then Allah goes into what? Then Allah talks about the story of Adam alayhi salam and his creation, the creation of Hawa, and what happened in Jannah, and then they're coming down from Jannah, and then life on earth, and so forth. Right? So Baqarah is the same. And so then Allah, so then we have here Surah Al-Baqarah, Surah Al-Alaq, the 96th chapter, verse 1 to 5. اقرأ باسم ربك الذي خلق خلق الإنسان من علق اقرأ وربك الأكرم الذي علم بالقلم علم الإنسان ما لم يعلم. So recite in the name of your Lord who created man from clots of blood. Recite, and your Lord is the most generous, he who taught by the pen, taught humanity what they knew not. You can see that Allah did not draw man's attention to draw man's attention, apostrophe S, to Allah's lordship and oneness, except by directing him towards his essence and the origin of his creation emergence. Right. So again, this is part of the approach. Allah doesn't say just worship me. Allah says, no, worship me. Why? I created you. I created you. I created you from a clot of blood. And your Lord is most generous, and your Lord taught you. Right? Allah doesn't just say, worship me. Okay. And then the first two pages of Surah Al-Baqarah, which constitute the beginning of the Quran in terms of the final text, identify the categories of man in this worldly life: the believers, the deniers, right? I mean, the unbelievers, the kafirun, and the hypocrites. Then they draw attention to the story of man's origin, how he multiplied, and what his final destination is. Then it repeatedly draws attention to this story whenever the need calls for it. Whenever the matter necessitates that his attention be drawn to so many of the signs and evidence of the universe and events and happenings of nations in order to demonstrate the evidence existence of his creator, his oneness in the last day, as well as matters and events that are connected to it. So what he's saying here is, again, and I'll finish on this point, is he's saying that the Quran is not laid out in that fashion where it's where it's like a normal textbook, right? It's not like chapter 1, where man comes from. Chapter 2, stories of the prophets. Chapter 3, everything that is halal. Chapter 4, everything that is haram. Chapter 5, the daily life. No, it's all interspersed, right? It's all interconnected, right? So Allah will tell you the story of a previous nation, but then remind you that He is the creator. Remind you that He is most just. Remind you that He is the most merciful. Remind you that He is the possessor of punishment. Right? He'll give a ruling and then remind you how He created you, and so on and so on and so forth. Right? Everything is interconnected. Right? So Allah is talking to you. Allah doesn't talk to you in isolation about something. Allah talks to you about everything at the same time. He might stress one point, but then remind you of everything else. Everything is interconnected. Right? It's interesting. Like I was discussing this yesterday with the other club, and that point came up. Like we were quoting like John Taylor Gatto. Like John Taylor Gatto, for example, as a school teacher for 30 plus years, he made that point. He said, like in our school systems, we teach we teach the disconnectedness of everything, right? Like kids go to school and they have 7 or 8, or I don't know, 6 or 8 subjects a day, and it's like math, geography, history, physics, French, Spanish, biology, whatever. They do all those subjects in the day, and no one ever shows them how they're connected. How is biology connected to history? How is history connected to physics? How is physics connected to English? No one ever shows them. And it's like you're there as a student. You're there for 50 minutes to an hour. Then the bell goes. You gather your things. You leave. Right? There isn't even like a reasonable. There's no conclusion to it. You just up, go, take the next class. Because like, okay, why does this class end at that point, and then why do I go here to this next class? Right? So this is what we will talk about in more depth next time, inshallah. Alhamdulillah, I'll finish there and open the floor for questions and answers. Barakallahu feekum.